Thank you to the entire team for tackling this topic. I really want to salute this university and the Institute for Environment, Health, and Society for the broad vision, the research agenda, and the educational agenda. It's a terrific initiative for the university. I also want to salute Andy. It's an honor to follow Andy. It's been a real pleasure to be here on sabbatical working with Andy for the last few months. And all I can say to all of you is, if you ever have a chance to work with Andy, drop whatever you're doing and take that chance. It will repay handsomely. And lastly, thank you for the hospitality. You would have had every right to rescind my invitation after President Trump's latest antics last week, but you didn't do that. Instead, you actually extended wonderful hospitality. You made me feel exactly like I'm back in Seattle by creating a day with downpour, and with the major decoration in the foyer happens to be a boat that people row, which is something we love in Seattle. So thank you. I'm going to tackle the topic of climate change and health. It'll be a deeper dive into one aspect of what Andy talked about, and I'll cover some of the same ground, but try to cover it in a slightly different way. I'm also going to do a second talk alongside the first talk. This is not just talking about climate change and health, but talking about how to talk about climate change and health. A meta-talk, if you will. Why am I doing that? I'm expecting that each of you will have occasion to talk about climate change and health. If not in a professional setting, then with friends and family. It's a formidable topic to talk about. It's a formidable topic because there is a vast amount of information. So much so that talking about the topic in an overview sense inherently takes you outside your zone of comfort and expertise. It's formidable because it's extremely complex. It's formidable because it is in many ways frightening. It's formidable because it is discouraging, if not depressing. So for those and other reasons, typically when I talk about climate change and health, the audience reaction is to flee. They don't typically flee physically as you see here, but this is the usual response. Every university lecturer has seen this, but I see it more than others because I talk about climate change and health. So it is worth it to be intentional and deliberate in considering how best to put this topic together in our own understanding, but also in our public discussion of the topic. I'll therefore be my own Greek chorus, and I'll step back periodically during this talk, and I'll reflect on how best to organize and frame a talk on a topic like this. So to begin, what should go into a presentation on climate change and health? Well, clearly talking about the health effects of climate change. That's the core of this topic. But one wants to present a bit of context before that and talk a bit about the climate science. One doesn't want to end just with a recitation of the diagnosis, if you will. One wants to move to the treatment and talk about some solutions. And while at it, provide some good news, because this is a grim enough topic that the good news is important to highlight. Speaking of solutions and good news, the very way we talk about climate change and the way we balance the good news and the threats is important, and that calls on us to talk about communications. Finally, at the end, it is important to leave every audience with hope. This should not be a hopeless topic. If you were a physician and you delivered to a patient a grim diagnosis, you wouldn't be doing your job if you didn't also deliver hope. So with that as background, let's get into it. The Lancet has identified climate change as the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. That's probably no exaggeration. It originates in these diagrams, which will look familiar to you from Andy's discussion of the Great Acceleration. Every measure of human activity, from population on the upper left, as the gentleman mentioned, to economic activity, even to human self-flagellation as the result of these patterns by eating at McDonald's. All of these have increased dramatically over the recent couple of centuries, and at the heart of all of that is increasing energy consumption. You'll notice that the energy consumption graph predominantly consists of coal in red, oil in green, natural gas in purple, the so-called fossil fuels because they were created over geological time. When you oxidize fossil fuels, since they are carbon-based, you create carbon dioxide emissions. Carbon dioxide emissions, sure enough, have been rising steadily from pre-industrial levels of about 280 parts per million up to just this past year when we have exceeded the 400 part per million threshold. This is a curved line. It's not exactly a straight line. More about that in just a minute. The carbon dioxide, in turn, when added to the atmosphere, acts as a greenhouse gas, much as a traditional greenhouse does. Much of the radiant energy that comes into the Earth's surface from the sun is absorbed. Much of it is reflected. We like that phenomenon because it keeps the Earth as warm as it needs to be for us to thrive as a species. But if we alter the balance, we thicken the greenhouse gas layer and retain more energy than the Earth emits, then we heat the Earth up. And that's a very simple explanation of the greenhouse gas effect. In fact, as Andy mentioned, the global average temperature has risen by about 1 degree centigrade over the last century or century and a half and continues to rise. Carbon dioxide isn't the only greenhouse gas. Methane also acts as a greenhouse gas, nitrous oxide, and some very small amounts of other compounds such as the chlorofluorocarbons. And the sectors, the activities in which we engage that result in the emission of greenhouse gases are shown here. The important message here is that almost every aspect of human activity is energy dependent. Since our energy supply mostly consists of fossil fuels, almost every aspect of what we do results in the emission of greenhouse gases. That means that as we think about decarbonizing the economy, we need to think very broadly and comprehensively. Now, I've shown you that the global average temperature is increasing, but there's another feature to that increase that bears mention. If we were to draw a line through that for the last 150 years, the line would have the slope that you see here. If we were to restrict our attention to the last 100 years, the line would look steeper. If we looked at the last 50 years, steeper still, and if we looked at the last 25 years, steeper still. That is to say, this is a steadily accelerating increase in the Earth's temperature. That should give us a sense of urgency. It's no surprise that 2016 was the hottest year on record. If I had been here at this symposium a year ago, I would have told you that 2015 was the hottest year on record. We're setting and breaking records on a regular basis now. This is a rapidly accelerating phenomenon. As Andy mentioned, we project future trends through building scenarios. And this is very much at the heart of climate science. So the scenarios are defined, the representative concentration pathways, or RCPs, several of them are shown here. Each one is associated with particular temperature projections, and each one is the basis for extensive computer modeling that helps to understand what the impacts would be. So a lot of the climate science that we do and that we apply to human health and well-being is based on this structure. There is a long-term commitment to climate warming. Even if we were to stop all carbon emissions today, which won't happen, there would continue to be a warming trend, sea level rises and so on for at least a century or two. If we were to continue emitting at current levels, there would be a commitment to a continued rise. That, again, underlines the sense of urgency that we need to have about tackling this problem. Very importantly, warming is not spread equally across the globe. There are complex global systems that determine where that excess energy that the globe has with it now plays out. And what you can see here for the 2014 year is that Europe, parts of Asia, especially in northeastern Asia, the northern tier of the globe have become especially fast warming parts of the globe. Sometimes there are extraordinarily hot places. This is 2015 data showing both in the Persian Gulf area and in India where heat waves drove the temperatures up to almost unimaginable levels. In the northern end of the left-hand picture, you'll see that the temperatures rose to 164 degrees Fahrenheit. That's over 70 degrees centigrade, incompatible with human civilization. And that is expected to continue over time. The Gulf region and the Red Sea have been carefully studied, and the title of the paper that presented these projections says it all. Future temperature in Southwest Asia projected to exceed a threshold for human adaptability. So the warming trend is accelerating fast. It is getting us into a domain that threatens the continuation of human functioning. Other Earth system changes are also occurring. Global sea level is rising because of thermal expansion of water and possibly with coming contributions from the melting of ice caps that are currently on land, but that if melting will contribute that water to the oceans. Arctic sea ice is decreasing in extent. That's important because as the Arctic becomes a dark-colored region rather than a light-colored region, it switches from being reflective to being absorptive and can lead to feedback loops, about which more in just a second. Those other Earth system changes in turn have led to a regular cascade of climate anomalies and events, many of which are shown here, and which will take us directly into a discussion of human health and well-being. So you'll see heat waves, you'll see severe storm activity. The warmer atmosphere holds more energy and holds more moisture. And that moisture tends to get dropped in precipitous, no pun intended, ways, large severe storms, large severe rainfall events, and very severe cyclonic events, tornadoes, hurricanes, cyclones, depending on the part of the world that you're in. The Earth system also features tipping points, and these are important to keep in mind. A tipping point in a complex system is a point beyond which the system may flip into a different equilibrium position, that a change may occur. So, for example, if there's an extensive melting of Arctic sea ice, shown up here, that may change the overall functioning of the Earth in terms of its balance of energy absorption and energy reflection. It makes it a darker Earth that absorbs more energy, a feedback loop we would not welcome. Very interesting scholarship has looked at the possible tipping points that may occur and ranked them in terms of how likely they are on the x-axis here and what the impact would be if they occurred on the y-axis. You can see that the loss of Arctic summer sea ice, which is now occurring rapidly, is highly probable, but relatively low impact compared to, say, the ENSO amplitude increase, the El Nino Southern Oscillation increase in amplitude, or the Atlantic thermohaline circulation shutdown. Lower probability tipping points, but with very, very large consequences for Earth systems. So this is a feature of any complex system, very much a part of the climate science story. And the last thing I'll mention about climate science is this, that the historical emissions are shown on this density equalizing cartogram. That's a fancy name for a distorted map above. This sizes each nation based on its historical contributions to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The lower panel shows the impacts of climate change on health, with countries sized according to the impacts they have suffered. And you can see that there's almost a complete non-correspondence. The countries that are suffering the most are the countries that have contributed the least to this problem, meaning that there is a profound ethical dimension to all of the climate science that I just reviewed. So the planetary impacts of climate change are widespread. They are varied from place to place. It's a global phenomenon that plays out locally. They are redefining normal on such parameters as temperature. We are committed to continued changes in this fashion for some centuries to come. Sudden changes may occur. The entire process is rapidly accelerating, and in addition to being troubling for obvious reasons of human sustainability, they're troubling for ethical reasons as well. Well, enough of the climate science. How do we introduce the complex issue of health impacts? The white slides are the Greek chorus slides where I'm going to think with you about how to package this material. Health information has to be framed. We need to use the time-honored pedagogical method of tell them what you're going to say it, and tell them what you said. So what are the key things that we would want to say about the health impacts of climate change? The first is simply to describe how climate change threatens health. The next is that we need to engage in complexity thinking. We heard about that earlier this morning, the need to be systems thinkers in understanding complex problems. But that should not be intimidating. That should be empowering. All of us can become systems thinkers. The threats are mostly familiar. We're not looking so much at brand new, unfamiliar threats, but we're looking at the amplification or multiplication of existing, long-standing threats. And that's important because we can deploy public health responses to protect people from many of those threats. But that said, the key message that we need to take away is that prevention is essential. This is a set of health threats that is so vast that Band-Aids won't work. We need primary prevention. So this is how I'd like to frame the issue of the health impacts of climate change. One of the ways to do that is with a system diagram. Andy showed one very much like this. This comes from the late Tony McMichael. It shows that there are systemic changes flowing from climate change. In some cases, they lead to direct health impacts, such as injury from severe storms. In some cases, they lead to secondary health impacts mediated through ecosystem changes, such as infectious disease risks. In some cases, they lead to tertiary impacts mediated through human systems and responses such as conflict. And there are beautiful diagrams like this one that can introduce the subject and frame it for an audience in a systems-based manner. On the other hand, you can simply show a linear list. This is the teaching method that I use a lot, called ODTAA, one damn thing after another. It lines up the health impacts of climate change and has the virtue of providing a sequential set of signposts to the description that will follow. Or you can compromise between the glitziness of a high-tech slide and the simple listing of terms by using this slide from the CDC's Climate and Health Program that has to be one of the most beautiful slides ever made. I didn't make it myself. But any of these, and you can choose which one you'd like to use, can frame for an audience the multiple health impacts of climate change that you'd like the audience to understand. In discussing the individual health impacts, we have to confront the fact that there are too many data to present in full, so we have to identify key points. It's very important and intellectually necessary to select illustrative data responsibly, not to cherry pick. We need to foreshadow solutions in talking about individual health problems, and we need to summarize key points because there is so much volume of material that it's impossible to keep it straight without helpful summaries. So these would be some of the pedagogical dimensions of talking about climate change and health. Now let's get into it. You'll see in the middle panel here there are 8 or 10 pathways through which climate change impacts health. I'm going to say a little bit about each one. You'll see me skipping slides in the interest of time, but I'll give you a sense of each one. And when I finish each one, I'll talk about what are the key take-home lessons from that particular aspect of health. Heat is the first one. It's very obvious. We know a lot physiologically about heat. We know about the various physiological responses to heat, and they're pictured here from the relatively mild and self-limited to the relatively severe. We have had a number of very serious recent heat waves, the 2003 heat wave in Europe, the 2010 heat wave in Russia, that have had very high mortality burdens, and they have been well studied epidemiologically. Here's an example of an epidemiologic tracing of the heat wave in Chicago in 1995. Very typically, you'll see the heat peaking at a certain point in time, and about 2 days later, you'll see mortality peaking. This is not a so-called harvesting effect, where the people who are killed are those who would have died in the next week or two anyway, the feeblest members of our society. These are, in fact, excess deaths. Epidemiologic characterization has made clear what the risk factors are for dying during a heat wave, ranging from individual attributes such as age and illness to social and environmental attributes such as living in neighborhoods that are high crime neighborhoods. Why is that? Because people in those neighborhoods don't want to open their windows. And if they keep the windows closed, their flats become even hotter than they would be otherwise, and promotes the impact of heat. We know that people can acclimatize to heat through a series of physiologic adjustments that are mentioned here. If we had more time, I would actually invite you to gaze at that interesting complex diagram down below. But people do acclimate. That's a physiologic adjustment. There's also a social adjustment called acclimatization that has resulted in the very happy trend that we have less mortality in response to a given amount of heat now than we did earlier in the century. And the main mechanism for that acclimatization is the widespread penetration of air conditioning. That's a two-edged sword because as air conditioning becomes more widespread, it uses more energy, much of which comes from fossil fuel consumption, but it does have the short-term impact of blunting the mortality impact of heat. Other things influence the biomedical effects of heat. One is urbanization. The world is rapidly urbanizing. More than 50% of us are urban now, and urban areas feature a phenomenon called the urban heat island. This is a phenomenon in which cities are warmer than the surrounding countryside due to the loss of evapotranspiration from trees, due to the density of dark surfaces that retain heat and re-radiate it at night when the city would otherwise cool down, and due to the concentrated local generation of heat. So heat is especially an urban problem. Andy mentioned the important spin-off impact of heat. It's not just a biomedical threat leading to mortality and morbidity, but it leads to a diminution in work capacity by the RCP 8.5 scenario in many places down to less than half of work capacity. so that outdoor construction workers, agricultural workers, police officers, the many professions that work outside will see limitations in the amount of work they can do, impacting economic output, especially in the hottest countries. A paper published last week introduced another dimension of heat that I personally hadn't thought about, and that is that insufficient nights of sleep become much more prevalent with warmer temperatures. Inadequate sleep, in turn, is a risk factor for a number of adverse health conditions and for just not feeling very well. So, broad-based impacts of heat. Fortunately, we know a lot about public health strategies for protecting people from heat. Heat wave preparedness planning, communications plans within cities, maintaining cooling centers, keeping those cooling centers with fuel so that if the electric grid goes down, they can still air condition, distributing water to people, and so on. All of that comprises heat wave preparedness planning, and it has demonstrably decreased mortality in the cities that have implemented such plans. So what do we learn from the heat story? That biomedical understanding is key, that social and environmental circumstances matter greatly, that concurrent trends matter a lot, and so we need to think as systems thinkers. The impact of heat extends beyond the biomedical, and that preparedness can help. It's kind of encapsulates the entire climate and health story with this one particular exposure. Second, severe weather events. I don't need to tell you about the increasing rate of typhoons, of cyclones, of the severest of these. This is a slide from Swiss Re, the reinsurance company, showing an increasing frequency of these events worldwide over the last 30 decades. This is actually happening quite fast when you think that this is almost a geological scale phenomenon. The IPCC issued a special report on extreme events, ranking the likelihood that various extreme events will occur more frequently. And you can see that they're listed here. Heavy precipitation is likely, warm temperature extremes is virtually certain, increasing heat waves, very likely, and so on. You can read that yourself. There is, by the way, a form of PowerPoint malpractice in which the speaker inflicts on the audience the reading of successive bullet points while the audience sits there knowing that they could do it themselves, so I'll try to avoid doing that. But a wide range of extreme weather events that will come with climate change. And this is one of these complex system diagrams that we won't have time to work through fully, but it shows that wind has particular impacts like power outages, storm surges have particular impacts such as exposure to floodwaters, and then through complex pathways, drinking water contamination may occur. In respect to the toxicologic expertise here at Brunel, the fact that contaminated water can lead to chemical contamination, flood waters can flood repositories of hazardous chemicals, so toxicology very much plays a role in the response to severe weather events. Sea level rise is another aspect of the severe event. Rising sea levels combined with storm surges. Large numbers of cities around the world concentrate population along coastal areas, putting large numbers of people at risk. We saw that in my country, in New Orleans, in the New York, New Jersey area recently with Superstorm Sandy, and the public health implications of these events are considerable. In poorer countries with large low-lying zones such as Bangladesh, millions and millions of people stand to be affected by storm events. And here is a projection for the London area, 2 degrees centigrade temperature increase on the upper panel and a 4 degrees temperature increase on the lower panel, showing the potential inundation of parts of the city and the Thames floodplain. So it's clear that many cities, despite the best engineering, will be at risk from rising sea levels. Tropical cyclones occur in well-known and well-defined zones around the world, putting coastal cities and inland cities in those areas at risk. Drought is another severe event, and drought is sort of the flip side of the coin of severe precipitation events, also brings with it a series of public health implications, as you can see here. The water shortages threatening livelihoods, but even such mundane pathways as making it more difficult to maintain sanitary conditions in healthcare facilities if there isn't enough water flowing to supply them. And all of these impacts, we know, disproportionately hit those who are least privileged and most marginalized or most deprived. We saw these are pictures from Hurricane Katrina, where the predominantly minority population of poor parts of New Orleans were the hardest hit parts of that city, and many of them still have not recovered years and years later, having been spread to the winds and never having firmly established the basis for a successful life. So vulnerability factors to severe events are well identified. The health consequences may be long-term, mental health consequences, interruption of care of non-communicable diseases, and so on. Preparedness for these events is essential. And by the way, that preparedness throws off a range of benefits. If you're prepared for a climate event, you're also prepared for an earthquake or for a terrorist event. These are in many ways standardized responses to emergencies. And resources in the aftermath for resilience and recovery are essential as well. Third pathway, air quality. Ozone is a secondary air pollutant formed in the air through the reaction of ozone precursors, oxides of nitrogen and hydrocarbons, in the presence of heat. If the heat rises and ozone levels rise, as these graphs show for Atlanta above and New York below, it's expected, all things being equal, that warmer temperatures will lead to higher ozone levels. Air quality also is threatened by the occurrence of wildfires, and wildfire risk rises with climate change for several reasons. One is that infestations of predators are killing trees on a vast scale. Much of the Canadian boreal forest is threatened now, turning viable forests into standing tinder. Droughts dry them out, and warming helps to facilitate the establishment and spread of fires, meaning that wildfire risk is higher in many parts of the world. This is a picture for the western U.S. showing the wildfires rising rapidly in recent years, exhausting the budgets of many of our park services, both at the state and at the federal level. This is a phenomenon happening in many parts of the world. With wildfires come smoke. Thick layers or thick levels of wildfire smoke are much like breathing in Beijing, high levels of particulate matter, with mortality rising in the short term in response. Allergies is related to air pollutants in that many of the allergens are spread by air. It turns out that in a divine joke on the human race, some of the plants that thrive the best with climate change aren't the crop plants, but they're the pest plants. And that includes ragweed, poison ivy, a number of the allergens. They grow more exuberantly under high CO2 conditions. The allergens in some cases become more allergenic. And pollen is produced at higher levels by some pollen-producing plants. So those of you with allergies or with asthma may find that over time, conditions are worse. In the US, we have documented an expansion of the ragweed pollen season by the number of days shown in each of those little circles by as much as a month longer in the northern tier. So existing research and practice pertaining both to the effects of air pollution on cardiovascular mortality and cancer, the effects of allergens, very applicable to understanding what we're seeing now. Medical vulnerability matters. Some subcategories of our population will be more susceptible than others based on underlying morbidity. And access to health care has to therefore be viewed as one of the adaptations to climate change. Fifth category, infectious diseases. This is a very simple cartoon demonstrating the potential impacts on vector biology of warmer climates. Many of the vector-borne diseases have traditionally been called tropical diseases, an implicit acknowledgement that diseases exist within particular ecosystem niches. Well, as you expand those ecosystems, in particular warm, wet ecosystems geographically, and as they climb to higher elevations, then it would stand to reason that there is a possibility of expanding the range of those diseases as well. So in very cartoonish fashion, that's what this picture illustrates. This is a panel from about 10 years ago listing the vector-borne diseases that are potentially affected by climate change. The likelihood of their altered distribution, shown by the color of the box here, in the number of people globally who are at risk. So it's clear that some of the most persistent and troublesome vector-borne diseases may be affected by climate change. Each of them needs to be empirically studied. In each case, the determinants of the spread of that disease go well beyond climate and ecosystem features to human behaviors, to the built environment, to land use, to many other factors. So climate change becomes one of a series of risks. How can climate change affect vector-borne diseases? Well, through direct pathways such as the ones shown here. For example, acceleration in pathogen development. A number of the pathogens actually reproduce more quickly with higher temperatures. A number of the vectors reproduce more quickly and feed more avidly, meaning biting people more frequently. Migration of certain vectors can be changed by changes in wind patterns, meaning that the diseases can spread. So a number of direct impacts as shown here. Also, a number of indirect impacts, such as hydrologic changes that leave different collections of water in various places that favor the growth of some mosquito or other vector species. So complex pathways. Let me show you just a couple of examples of research done on infectious diseases to track increases in risk to date and projected increases of risk into the future. This is a picture of the rise of dengue fever in the Americas from 1980 to 2007, and you can see that the rise has been fairly steady, and projections to the future show that very greatly expanded regions of the Americas will be dengue risk regions. So this is a trend we expect to continue. Partly driven by dysfunctions in health systems and partly driven by changes in the underlying biology of the disease. Malaria, a very complicated disease and one that puts hundreds of millions of people at risk globally. It's been extensively modeled in Africa, and what we see is that in some areas the risk will decrease, mostly due to decreased rainfall. In other areas the risk will increase. Malaria is rising to higher altitudes than it has previously been seen at, and it is moving to highland areas in parts of the continent that were previously relatively free of malaria. That's projected to continue in coming years. Lyme disease is the third example I'll mention. This is the state of Minnesota for those who don't recognize that. And what you can see is that from the 90s up to the present time, there's been a rapid increase in the prevalence of Lyme disease. I could show you a similar map for much of the North American northern tier up into Canada as well. Even in Alaska, a state that previously was far too cold for ticks to have much activity there, we've been seeing a fair amount of Lyme disease. And the projections for the future hold that there will be quite an expansion of this disease. Similar projections have been made and documented for Europe to date and into the future. So that's the vector-borne infectious diseases. There's also the question of waterborne infectious diseases, the sixth of the categories that I'll talk about. This was a really nice piece of research done about a decade ago, correlating severe rainfall events with outbreaks of diarrheal disease. And it turns out there's quite a close correlation, meaning that the severe rainfall events probably wash pathogens into water supplies. Very easy to understand for surface water, documented for groundwater as well. And so we can expect that with more severe rainfall events, we will see more risky situations for diarrheal diseases. This is a recently published study from several Canadian provinces, I give just one, Alberta, tracking the occurrence of Salmonella, E. coli, and Campylobacter diarrhea by week over the course of the summer, showing that these diseases tend to be associated with warm weather. So with more warm weather, we can expect more risk for these diseases as well, meaning that our response has to look at the cleanliness and the protection of water supplies as an important part of climate response. And in poor countries, again, the impact will be greater. This is an estimate of the annual increase in E. coli-driven diarrhea in Bangladesh, and you can see from the numbers, well, you can't see from the numbers, but with temperature increases, millions and millions more people, 10 million here, are expected to be at risk of E. coli diarrhea. So both vector-borne and waterborne diseases increasing their risk profiles. And I'm going to skip these. The summary on the infectious disease story, both for vector-borne and for waterborne, is a reminder that many infectious diseases are weather and climate sensitive. We know about these diseases. These mostly aren't new, but the risks are amplified and geographically spread. Climate is only one of the determinants. There are other determinants which offer opportunities for us to intervene to protect public health. Food and nutrition. Andy's mentioned this in quite a bit of detail, so I'll kind of move through this quickly. But the take-home message here is that climate changes will change and in many areas of the world diminish the capacity to produce food. The CO2 fertilization effect, in theory, can help prompt the growth of some crops, especially the C3 crops. But when combined with changes in rainfall, with the effect of heat waves, with more storms and so on, it turns out that empirically that doesn't quite work out that way. We have good empirical data now looking at the impact of climate on various crop production, and for 4 of the major crops, maize, wheat, soy, and rice, this systematic review shows that there are decreases in output in each of the areas of the world that have been studied. Projected crop yields in 2050 are distributed like this. The redder the color, the more decrease in productivity. And you can see that the areas that will be hardest hit are the areas of the country where hunger, or the areas of the world where hunger is already widely pervasive. On the other hand, there is good news for parts of Europe and for North America. In the wealthy parts of the world, the expectation is that there are enough resources and enough adaptive capacity that we probably won't see major food shortages, but there will certainly be grounds for enormous concern in poorer parts of the world. Pests and pathogens, in many cases, thrive under climate scenarios. In fact, this study shows that many pests are moving away from the equator poleward, threatening farmers in their ability to raise crops. And we expect that to be a continuing pattern, which may actually complicate the otherwise partially optimistic projections of food production in the northern tier of the world. Weeds also grow, in some cases, very favorably under climate change scenarios, higher CO2 and more water, and compete more successfully with plants than they do now. Not only do weeds grow more successfully, but a number of the herbicides that we typically use to control weeds are less effective, introducing the possibility that farmers will increase their herbicide use, resulting in more herbicide content in the foods that come to market, another link between toxicologic mechanisms, one of the Brunel specialties, and climate change. Well, not only will the quantity of foods produced be diminished, but as Andy mentioned, the quality of food is threatened as well. Aflatoxin growth is promoted under warm conditions, and that seriously impairs food quality. In addition, the protein content of food and the mineral content of food decreases under climate scenarios, and I won't repeat that since Andy took us through that. Now, when food production drops, food prices rise. Here are some projections of food prices later in the century. The blue bar indicates expected rises in food prices if not for climate change. And the scored bar and the brown bar represent expected increases in food prices due to the additional impact that climate change is expected to have. So we're looking at accelerated increases in food prices. Why does that matter? Well, many people, even in wealthy countries, are food insecure. This is a graph of food insecurity in the US. We hovered at around 12%. With the Great Recession, we went up to about 15%, and we're only now beginning to come down a little bit, a shameful reflection on the situation in an otherwise wealthy country. It's 1 out of 7 people food insecure, defined as having not had enough to eat at some time in the last month. In Europe, the same problem exists. Here's the UK with about 10% of the population food insecure, far higher numbers in some countries of Europe. Now, we know something about what food insecure people do when food prices rise. They buy the least expensive food they can find. And what we know is that the least expensive foods, the ones that are shown down here, are the ones that are the most energy dense, nutrient poor. So you see lard and margarine, no offense to any of you who love lard and margarine. And up at the other end, you see lettuce, broccoli, the kinds of foods that we physicians are telling our patients they need to eat more of. But as the pressure of prices drives people toward less expensive, more energy-dense food, it's likely that we will find ourselves aggravating the obesity epidemic and the non-communicable diseases that flow from that. Hunger, of course, is far more pervasive in the global south, raising the risk of infectious disease, raising the risk of malnutrition, and having spin-off effects like people dropping out of school, which then circles back to the population issue that we talked about just a minute ago. Unsuccessful schooling impairs our desire to drop population growth as well as to bring prosperity to the world. So the hunger will be a problem. Climate change aggravates existing problems of food insecurity, both in terms of quantity and in terms of quality of food. disproportionate impacts on those who are food insecure, both in the wealthy and in the poor parts of the world. This, I think, will be one of the biggest impacts of climate change on health. I mean, it typically comes about 5th or 6th in everybody's list, with heat being the first. Heat is relatively simple and well understood. Food is extremely complex. It's a system problem, but it's an enormous problem. We will need to adapt by developing new strains of seeds, drought-tolerant, salt-tolerant, heat-tolerant plants, and by rejigging the food system in many ways. Mental health, a widely neglected aspect of health and well-being in the medical world in general, widely neglected in the climate change world as well. How might climate change threaten mental health? You can probably imagine some of the ways. One is that in the aftermath of a disaster, mental health suffers a great deal. When people's lives are upended, when they're displaced from where they live, when all of their support systems become chaotic, that has drastic impacts on the risk of depression and anxiety. We see increasing levels of domestic abuse, of substance abuse, and so on. So this is a big impact from disasters. Secondly, I'm going to introduce the second mental health pathway with this picture. This is the nuclear bomb exploding over Hiroshima. It may seem an out-of-place image for a talk like this, but it's close to my experience because I grew up, I'm probably older than almost everybody here, I grew up in the 50s and 60s. In the United States, we were in the midst of the Cold War, and the narrative was that the Russians were about to drop bombs on us. So what we did as kids in school was we had air raid drills. The siren would go off, and we were told to practice by getting under our desks, hugging our knees, looking at a part of our anatomy that we weren't ordinarily permitted to look at during school hours, and that would protect us from the bomb when it fell. This little girl is disobeying instructions and looking up, so she won't be fully protected. These children did not put their entire body under their desks, so they'll be protected from the waist up. I'm joking about this, but it was actually not a cheerful prospect under which to grow up. Here's a woman saying, "This past summer I got deeply depressed about our planet, as if I didn't have enough problems of my own." The sense of growing up and living under the shadow of these grim scenarios is very, very weighty. This is a burden on mental health, potentially raising the risk of anxiety, depression, and so on. The term solastalgia has been coined by an Australian philosopher to describe the distress caused by environmental degradation. And really, all of us are seeing this, not just those of us who live in coastal areas that have been visibly degraded, but the sense that the world is not the secure and predictable place that we thought it was. And finally, those with severe mental illness are at special risk during extreme heat events for reasons that have to do with their physiology, their ability to recognize and act on hazards, and with side effects of some of the medications. So this is a particular risk group during heat. So in those several ways, climate change does threaten mental health. This is probably a very widespread, if under-recognized aspect. Ninth and almost final, conflict. This is the cover page of a book by the eminent and intrepid Professor Ellsworth Huntington of Yale University, who a century ago wrote, "Almost any American or European who has traveled or resided within the tropics will confess that he has occasionally flown into a passion and perhaps used physical violence under circumstances which at home would have merely made him vexed." The association between heat and violence. Now I know what you're thinking. If he had come from Brunel or the London School of Hygiene or the University of Washington, he could have controlled those passions, but he came from Yale, so he fell prey to them. It does raise the possibility that heat predicts violence, and in fact we have epidemiologic data suggesting exactly that. This is a study, for example, showing the relationship between temperature and violent crime in Dallas, and here you see violent crime levels rising up to a certain point simply with rising heat. The relationship between heat and suicide is less clear. The literature is ambiguous on this, but at least some studies, this was a particularly rigorous one, in 2 cities, Toronto and Jackson, Mississippi, seems to show an increase in suicide risk with rising temperatures beyond a certain equilibrium point. So we have more to learn about that, but at the interpersonal level of violence and self-harm, there is some evidence to suggest that heat may aggravate those problems. On the group level, we have growing evidence, as Andy mentioned, that heat and all of the collateral aspects of climate change may aggravate group violence as well. a credible, although hotly debated argument that the Darfur conflict was a climate-related conflict, but also very credible evidence that the Syrian conflict is climate-related. And that leads to the final aspect that I'll mention, which is migration, displacement, the need for people to relocate from where they are, sometimes driven by violence, which is sometimes contributed to by climate, sometimes driven to migrate by simply a degradation of the ability to make a livelihood. Disasters displaced millions of people just in 2014, as shown in this graphic, many of them in China due to typhoons, typhoon in Japan, typhoons in the Philippines. Not all of these are climate related. Some are seismic, such as in Chile, but we can expect displacement acutely due to disasters. We can expect slower displacement due to the gradual degradation of environments, the concept that's been called managed retreat, that you can see that the environment is becoming unlivable, and so you plan for and you execute a migration, as South Pacific Islands are doing, as coastal villages in Alaska are doing, and indeed, as some very large coastal cities, such as New Orleans or Los Angeles or New York, may have to consider as well. Hardly ever talked about. It's impossible to get our minds around the prospect of moving a major city, but it may be in the future. So this is a large and unrecognized potential for suffering, both war and migration, upending the basis of people's lives, and huge impacts on public health, and changes for which preparedness, anticipation, and service delivery are necessary. So this summarizes what I've gone through. It's a very long list. I've gone through it very fast, but you should get the sense from this that there is a lot there. Climate change is a major public health threat, and I hope you don't feel too depressed right now. What we've learned is that we have to think about brand new topics that we never learned about in medical school or public health school. We need to become much better systems thinkers and think in a very multidisciplinary way, both about understanding and about reacting. We need to change some of the methods we use, for example, modeling, and we need to be devising effective ways to protect health through the challenges that are coming. Well, fortunately, there is a large public health toolbox that will help us in protecting health, and there is a growing literature that helps us understand the steps we have to take. Climate change action usually revolves around two concepts: mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation meaning steps that we take to reduce global warming, adaptation meaning steps that we take to cope with and to reduce the harm from the global warming that is unavoidable. Those map directly to time-honored public health concepts. Mitigation is nothing but prevention, and adaptation is nothing but preparedness, and these are things we talk about in public health all the time. There is a standard structure of public health actions that's shown here. Anybody who's trained in public health will recognize this picture. And it turns out that we can map many of the steps we have to take in response to public health to these traditional public health functions. Arguably, the forecasting and modeling is relatively new, but all of the other things we do, public health surveillance to look for the rise of new infectious diseases or old infectious diseases in new places, we know how to do that. Outbreak investigations, we know how to do that. Communication, we know how to do that. More about that in just a minute. So the public health framework works well in adapting to climate change and taking steps to protect the public. Andy mentioned steps we have to take within the healthcare system, both to set an example and to reduce emissions. In our country, the healthcare system represents 1/6 of the economy, and it's an energy-intensive 1/6 of the economy, so it's an important place for us to work. We also show leadership and model a response. Innovations are happening across the economy. These constitute primary prevention. For each of these, there are health benefits, and each of these can be done in ways that protect health if health is figured into the way they are executed. So we've seen innovations in transportation. We've also seen going back to old methods of transportation that turn out to serve very, very well. This 8-year-old kid was your speaker with his first bicycle. My mother gave me that picture when she found it. But active transportation, walking and cycling, and mass transit, both are part of climate mitigation, which also throw off public health benefits, as we'll come back to. Innovations in energy are spreading widely, with renewable energy sources now becoming cheaper than traditional fossil fuel sources. Innovations in buildings, building extremely energy efficient buildings, which in many cases, if well designed, are also extremely healthy and comfortable buildings for people to occupy. Innovations in neighborhoods, much of which involve finding the old in the new. So not building in Atlanta anymore, but identifying the benefits of a Barcelona and building more of that. Walkable, mixed use, connected, pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods with activity centers that attract people. This is a more sustainable form of urban design, one that also offers public health benefits. Innovations in food that often involve finding the old in the new, locally grown food, food grown with a decreased use of chemical inputs, food that has to travel less distance from farm to market. This implies more seasonal eating, and also more eating lower on the food chain. All of these steps are important mitigation steps. All of them yield public health benefits. Communication, a great opportunity for climate mitigation. The telephone, the conference call, can replace a lot of face-to-face meetings that require travel. But if you can't use any of the new communication technologies these days to mitigate the need for traveling and to reduce the carbon footprint of your professional life, then you haven't been paying attention to these opportunities that are multiplying. All of these trends are having the effect of decoupling economic growth from carbon emissions. These pictures show the energy consumption per unit of GDP, these lines here, and the carbon emissions per unit of energy consumption, these lines here, in OECD and non-OECD countries respectively. We are on a path toward decarbonizing the economy. We have a long way to go, but we're moving in that direction thanks to the innovations that I mentioned just a minute ago. I'd like to let you know about the Lancet Commission, which is tracking progress in these areas, both the innovations themselves and their benefits for health. Each year, for the next few years, and hopefully beyond that, there will be an annual report tracking global progress in meeting these goals using the parameters that you see listed here. So this is an important and essential global project. There is good news, it's moving ahead, and it's being tracked along with its impacts on and benefits for health. Let me close by reflecting for just a minute about climate communication. Now, why should a health person be talking to you about communication of a difficult topic? Well, we are actually pretty experienced at communicating at difficult topics. We are the ones who tell people that they have to submit to colonoscopies, that they have to reduce the amount of food they eat, that they have to quit smoking, that they have to use condoms, sometimes all at the same time. That's not always easy news to deliver. So shouldn't we take what we've learned from that and apply it to delivering information and to motivating behavior change when it comes to climate change? Well, to do that, social marketing tells us that we need to understand our audiences. Just as I assess a patient's frame of mind before talking to the patient about a behavioral change, we need to assess the public and its ways of thinking before discussing climate change and needed policy responses and behavioral responses. This is a picture of what's been called the 6 Americas by the Yale and George Mason University Center for Climate Communication, emphasizing that, like any marketer knows, an audience can be segmented based on its belief structure, and the communication has to be tailored to each segment of the audience. There's good news here. As we look at audience beliefs, this is a picture just in the US, which is arguably the country that's richest in climate deniers of any of the wealthy countries. The proportion of Americans who say global warming is occurring is now higher than it's ever been. And this last data point came from after the Trump election. The proportion who believe that global warming is caused by human activities is the highest that it's ever been, and so on. So the survey responses are actually trending in a positive direction, possibly because people are witnessing the impacts of climate change, possibly because the depredations of the Trump administration are causing concern. This is the proportion of Americans state by state who support participating in the Paris Agreement, and you'll notice that if it's tan up to brown, it's above 50%, a majority in every state in the country. So this is arguably one of the difficult publics, but it's a public that is on board. That said, there are deep partisan divides. The level of concern is quite high for liberal Democrats, and I mean Democrats who are liberal, not the Lib Dems here. This is American data. And very low among conservative Republicans. So we have a polarized society, but clear majorities believe that this is an issue that we need to tackle. In fact, majority in all 40 nations polled by a Pew Research Center study conducted recently say that climate change is a serious problem, and over half of people globally say it's a very serious problem. So we have a public out there that cares about this issue. Interestingly, the concern seems to be higher among the nations with lower CO2 emissions. There may be some complacency among the wealthy nations that have been big emitters. That's a challenge for us to move our own country, our fellow citizens, I was going to say countrymen, but countrymen and women, along in adopting positive climate policies. Well, why is it that people don't engage this issue? I referred to this earlier on. This is an unprecedented problem. It's a complicated problem. People tend to discount risks. We know from behavioral economics. Daily experience, for the most part, doesn't confirm that climate change is occurring, and so on. Many reasons why it's difficult for people fully to grapple with this issue. And the communication that we undertake, the way that we have conversations with friends and family about the impacts of climate on health, need to reckon with these barriers. In addition, there are deliberate efforts to undermine climate science. These have been especially nefarious in the US. They helped elect a Congress that doesn't want to act on climate and which therefore doesn't represent the public. But this is an important factor as well. Scientists are very trusted sources of information. Physicians and other health professionals are trusted sources of information. And one of the most important trusted sources of information is family and friends, most of whom communicate with us now through Facebook. Most of us have Facebook feeds that are comprised of the views of selected family and friends. So getting into networks of believers, developing trusted advisors, trusted sources of information who can talk about this issue are key steps in communicating well. More and more climate communication strategies are being published. This is one particular source, News Media and Climate Politics. Tell success stories, tell about cities that have begun to move toward mass transit successfully, tell about alternative food sources and so on. People are excited by stories of entrepreneurial activism and everyday heroism. People need to understand political successes. Localized information helps. So these are standard emerging keys to successful communication about this formidable topic. It works for many people when climate change is framed as a health issue. This is a particular study that offered respondents 3 frames. If we tackle climate change, it'll make us more secure as a nation. If we tackle climate change, it'll protect our health and the health of our children. If we tackle climate change, it'll protect the environment. And the health frame elicited more hope and less anger than the others in the most skeptical respondents. So thoughtful analysis and research about how to communicate this issue is very much in order. Frank Luntz is a Republican political strategist who helped Trump win. And he explained the center of his communication approach this way. You say it again, and 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 again, and again, and again, and then when you're finished, you say it again, and again, and again. So repetition helps. It's one of the reasons that I don't feel quite so badly repeating some of the things that Andy said. But in general, as we convey messages about how urgent the problem is and what steps we need to take to tackle it, repetition is a part of the answer as well. What doesn't work? Being overly fatalistic, as you see in these pictures. Exaggerating, there's no need, and in fact it's impermissible to exaggerate the facts, as you see in this otherwise fine scientific journal. Here's a nice example of a poor communication strategy. This was an article published in the International Journal of Epidemiology a few years back on population adiposity and climate change. And what it showed was that adiposity is worsening climate change because those overweight people use more fuel to travel and eat more food, which has a carbon footprint. You can like or not like the analysis, but this inimitable piece of British journalism didn't do much for anybody by reporting it this way. And finally, unbalanced provision of information doesn't serve well. This sign has sharp edges, Don't touch the edges of this sign. Also, the bridge is out ahead. So balance and perspective in the messages we deliver, very important. Co-benefits are the good news story lurking at the center of the health and climate narrative. This is a picture of Bonor's electromagnetic bathing fluid. This is the medication my mother raised me on when I was a child. It cured neuralgia, cholera, rheumatism, paralysis, hip diseases, measles, everything. It was great. Well, we don't actually have medications that do this, but we have interventions that throw off that many health benefits and environmental benefits and economic benefits, and to the extent that we can identify those, celebrate them, and implement them, we win. One example that Andy mentioned is cycling. More cycling and less driving means a reduction in car crash fatalities, it means an improvement in air quality, and it means more physical activity, helping to combat the obesity epidemic and reduce cardiovascular disease risk. Electric vehicles, in this study in Rotterdam, showed that a switch to electric vehicles would reduce annoyance, noise, sleep disturbances. That's good. Changing our diets to a lower carbon footprint diet. This graphic shows that broccoli, eggplant, cauliflower, and rice use up less than 0.01 gallons of gasoline, whereas this 6 ounces of beefsteak, isocaloric, 320 calories, uses up 0.16 gallons of gasoline to produce. The carbon footprints are shown here. Far lower carbon footprint for the vegetable diet than for the meat-dependent diet. In fact, we've had good analyses lately of the carbon footprints of various food groups, and without the time to go through this slide, I'll simply give you the take-home message, which is that ruminants, meat, red meat, has a very high carbon footprint compared to more vegetable and fruit-based diets. That's good news, because even if there were no climate change, we would want to be telling people to reduce their meat intake. Lower meat diets, higher vegetable, fiber, and fruit diets are far healthier. There are all the reasons in the world to reduce meat intake, so this is another source of co-benefits. There are lots of co-benefits to dealing with climate change. If we achieve energy independence, preserve rainforests, sustainability, and importantly, healthy children, even if there were no climate change, we would be happy to do those things. So we're heading down a path toward human thriving, toward environmental sustainability, and toward economic sustainability, and that's a good thing. Finally, the last thing I'll say is there are reasons for hope. This is a slide that is now several years old, but it still holds true. Public perception is changing for the better, globally and in the problem countries like mine. Climate change is no longer viewed just as an environmental problem, it's viewed as an opportunity for new forms of thriving economic life. China is coming along and becoming a world leader. Renewable energy is growing fast and the prices are coming down fast. Carbon pricing is here in many markets around the world. So these are true reasons for hope. Reasons that we can expect that we can protect human health and well-being now and into future generations. So I've told you that climate change is a public health priority and that therefore climate mitigation and adaptation are public health strategies. We know a lot about how to tackle climate adaptation and protect health, but we need prevention. And to achieve prevention, that is climate mitigation, we need to innovate. We're doing that. We need to communicate effectively. We know more and more about how to do that. We need to celebrate the co-benefits, and we need to maintain hope, give hope to the next generation of students, our children and their grandchildren. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this amazing talk. I know we've gone into lunch, but I don't think anybody would mind if we just had one quick question for Howie. Burning question. There's one in the back.
Burning.
Oh, burning question.
Hi, Howard from Seattle. I'm Maria from Montreal.
Hi.
I'm studying water engineering here at Brunel, but I've also studied finance. And I was curious to see what you would think about implementing water trade internationally, if only to create a short-term solution. Climate change,
Boy.
all the other problems.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Water is one of those topics that I find so confusing that and so complex that it hurts my head to think about it. Some people argue that water is a right and that we should stay away from commercializing it and maintain it as a right. On the other hand, it's very hard to think about a scarce physical resource as a right. What does it mean ethically or politically to say that people are entitled to something when there isn't enough of that something to go around? Then there's the ecological question of interbasin water transfers or international water transfers, which can be ecologically complicated and economically challenging. Then there's the question of large-scale desalination in coastal areas, which may become more feasible than ever if we get on top of solar energy techniques. So all of that by way of saying I have great respect for the complexity of the topic and don't really wouldn't presume to offer any solutions. But I will tell you, biomedically, people need water. And we either bring water to where people are, or people will come to where the water is. So it's absolutely a motivating factor in coming years.